Yeah, man? Okay, excellent. Okay, guys, welcome. I've got a lot to cover in 45 minutes, like a lot. And so what I want to do with you is just briefly introduce myself, Mike Cottmeyer, CEO of Leading Agile. I started my company 8 years ago, specifically focusing on not just training people how to do Agile, but how to actually make changes within the organization that are necessary to actually be able to do it. Right? I imagine for you guys that are trying to adopt Agile, there's all kinds of institutional barriers that are getting in the way. And so transformation is really about trying to figure out how to overcome those institutional barriers. Okay? And so since we're running so short on time, I'm not going to do much more of an introduction than that. But what this talk is fundamentally, first and foremost about, is the idea of how do we get people to move? Okay, how do we get sufficient mind share to get people to change? Okay, and so what we're going to do is, and keep them moving, by the way. So this talk exists on 2 levels. Okay, so it's basically 2 levels and a paper. Okay, so the wrapper of the talk, okay, which is, we're going to go through here in just a second, which is the why, what, how, who, and all of the sub-bullets, are going to be the things that I think that you need to consider as you engage in your transformation, okay? I believe that those 8 things that are up on the board right now are inarguable. If you don't consider them, you will likely fail. Up underneath that, kind of the core content of the talk is how I think about implementing those things, right? So I would encourage you not to discount the wrapper. Feel free to discount, or disagree with me like on the content, right? Because this is what we've experienced in our practice. And one of the things that's been kind of interesting is that, is trying to build a company around doing this kind of stuff, you have to get super explicit about what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, right? So that's what this talk's about. So 2 levels. There's the wrapper. There's the content inside the wrapper. And then if you want more detail on the content inside the wrapper, that's where the paper comes in, okay? So the 8 things that I want to talk with you guys about. The first thing is, if you're going to do an Agile transformation, you better understand why you're doing it. Does that make sense? Okay? We don't want to adopt Agile for the sake of adopting Agile. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what is a compelling business case for adopting Agile? And I'm going to even suggest that depending upon the nature of your business case, it's going to change how you adopt Agile. Okay, depending upon what you're trying to achieve, it's going to inform your transformation. The next piece that we're going to talk about is how to create a transformation hypothesis, because you guys are going to encounter resistance, and the kinds of resistance that you're going to encounter is going to inform how you do your transformation. So we're going to talk through the kinds of things that you might encounter, and I'm going to challenge you to think about what bet you're going to place and how you believe that bet is actually going to result in the business outcomes that you want to get. Third one, we are going to talk about a theory and approach to transformation. Okay? And so one of the things that I'm going to challenge you to do is to think through, what is it going to look like to get there? As an Agile community, we tend to be really good at knowing where we are and knowing where we want to be. But you know what? There's a lot of intermediate states between where you are and what you want to be. And you need to think through what those intermediate states might be. The fourth thing, we're going to talk about a reference architecture for agility, especially agility at scale. So if you guys think about safe, disciplined Agile delivery, large-scale Scrum, even team-level Scrum, Kanban, XP, all of those methodologies have a fundamental reference architecture in mind. And what the methodologies have done is have encoded a reference implementation on top of that reference architecture. So what I believe is that what matters is the reference architecture, not the reference implementation. As long as we get the fundamentals right, you guys have a lot of freedom, maybe more than you think, about how to implement the methodology. Okay? After that, we're going to talk a little bit about how to manage change. Then we're going to talk about how to measure results. Then we're going to talk about the skills and experiences necessary to do this. And then, we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities necessary to do this. And then we're going to talk about the skills and experiences necessary. And we're going to do that in about 43 minutes. Do you believe me? I don't think I'm going to either, right? So we'll see, right? So we're going to hit the high level. We're going to at least hit the wrapper. We're going to hit a little bit on the inside. And then if you guys need more information, you guys can go hit the white paper. Okay? Deal? Okay, excellent. Okay, so that's the white paper. Oh, white paper, leadingagile.com/white paper. Pretty simple, but there's cards on the table if you guys forget that. So, okay, excellent. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about a business case. Back in the day, one of my early formative experiences with Agile is I got to work with version 1 for a couple years. And one of the things that I noticed when I got immersed into the Agile community is that Agilists like to talk about responding to change. We like to talk about adaptation. And if you are trying to implement Agile for the sake of responding to change and adaptation, that's going to create a certain mental model around the kinds of things that you need to do. One of the things that I would challenge you guys on, though, is that a lot of companies are actually not necessarily trying to respond to change. You guys might be trying to respond to change, but the organization as a whole may or may not be trying to respond to change, okay? So when we talk about building a business case for what we're trying to do with Agile, we have to understand what our executive teams are willing to pay for, okay? Because if they're not willing to pay for the benefit, then they're not going to make the necessary, they're not going to overcome the challenges necessary in order to achieve the goal, right? So the 6 things that we see most often from executives that want to embark upon a transformation, 4 of them are counterintuitive to a lot of Agilists. Predictability, I would suggest, is the #1 reason people say that they want to adapt Agile. Does that seem counterintuitive? Okay. Does anybody think that's wrong? Yeah, people want to be able to make and meet commitments. The next thing that they want to be able to do is to improve quality. Okay, so all of the testing practices and continuous integration and all that kind of stuff really drives quality, right? We want to reduce the number of escape defects out of a sprint and into the release. Okay, the third thing, they want to be able to get things into market faster so they can start charging money for them. Does that feel like a reasonable goal? Okay, we want to drop the code, we want to get people paying for it, we want to accelerate revenue. Third thing, we want to lower costs. Is anybody in a situation where somebody said, yeah, let's do Agile because it'll help us reduce our overhead and reduce our costs and reduce our waste and all that kind of stuff? Right, it's kind of fair. It's almost like a Dilbert cartoon though, right? Let's do Agile. Well, you know, why do we want to do Agile? Well, because it's going to save us money. Well, Agile's not going to save you money. Well, find me something that will actually save us money, right? And cost savings is really kind of an interesting thing from an Agile perspective because there is often a lot of waste and overhead in organizations, but the challenge is that most organizations are so overloaded with work, right? Even if you get the system like really humming, right? You don't necessarily get to take people out of it because there's so much to do. So a lot of times with Agile, it's really tough to promise cost savings, but you can often promise to align the people and the resources that are available to the highest priority initiatives, okay? But if that's the goal, we need to really understand that that's the goal. Third thing, we want to be able to do innovation. If you want to do innovation, that is a different game than if you want to do predictability or cost savings. Okay, it's just a different game, right? And you design your Agile ecosystem differently for an innovation type environment versus a predictability type environment. The last thing that I would suggest is that one of the things people are trying to do is they're trying to go for, are we building the right product? Okay, that's what I call product fit. Okay, so are we building something that customers will actually use? Now, more often than not, companies want all 6 of these things. Okay? Sometimes they want to do Agile because Agile's cool and everybody's doing it and all their CIO buddies are doing it. Sometimes they want to do Agile for retention and hiring and things like that, right? To make sure they can get the right people in. That may or may not influence the design. But these 6, I don't know why I said it. I was going to say these 6, this is actually 3, but these 6 are the things that I believe are going to drive your transformation most. Okay? You guys with me so far? Okay, excellent. Okay, so the next thing, transformation hypothesis. When When I go to Agile conferences, most of the time when people are thinking about doing Agile, the language that I hear is that Agile is a culture change or a mind shift change. Who believes that Agile is like culture and mind shift first? Really, nobody? Come on, really? Because that's the thing that I hear all the time. And the thing that I'm trying to impress upon the world, really, is that Agile, to do Agile right, is, yeah, sure, it's about creating the right culture and the right mindset. But what I believe is that the underlying ecosystem of most companies is so incongruent with that mindset and that demonstrated set of behaviors that just changing the mindset is not going to increase agility, and it's not going to furthermore produce the business benefits that the company's investing in Agile to go do. Okay? So what happens is that at some point in time as change agents, you guys are going to make a bet. You're going to go do something. And that thing that you do needs to have an outcome that ties back to the business case. And you're making a hypothesis that basically says, if I do X, Y will happen. If I train people, then this will happen. If I introduce cultural stuff, then this will happen. So let me talk through the three primary kinds of things that we talk about, right? If you are going down the culture path, what you're fundamentally doing is you're suggesting that if I can change culture, that the way the group forms teams and the way that it does governance and the way that it does interactions and the way that it intakes work, that all of that stuff will change. Right? A lot of times one of the big challenges, I'm going to talk about this here in a little bit, is that dependencies are going to be in the way. Right? So is culture going to help us remove dependencies? Maybe, maybe not. Right? If I teach people Scrum or SAFe or XP or Kanban or whatever, is teaching them the practices going to help them change culture if the ecosystem that they're operating in, that you're applying those practices within, is not congruent? If I have a siloed waterfall structure that now starts doing Scrum, right, what's going to come of that? A lot of times you get the Scrummerfall thing we talk about. Okay? So sometimes the practices in and of themselves don't necessarily drive the change. And so what we believe is that a transformation is about three things. It's about creating a hypothesis for how you're going to form teams, how you're going to govern, how you're going to kind of get to working tested software. And it's about enabling that system of delivery with appropriate practices given its current state. And then within that aligned context, encouraging culture change. Okay? So if you bet on culture, you need a hypothesis for how culture is going to impact the other two things. If you bet on practices, you've got to have a hypothesis for how those practices are going to impact the other two things. What I suggest is that you focus on all three simultaneously. Okay? The next thing that you want to think about, see how I'm doing here. Okay, cool. I can see it here, but I was getting confused as to like which slide is which on my little presenter view. The next thing that you want to think about is as you engage, this topic came up in the last conversation, a single team transformation is probably different than a large scale transformation. If you've got 7 or 8 people, sure, right? Take them out to lunch, talk to them about Agile, introduce the culture practices, run some experiments, teach them how to do Scrum, you're probably fine. If you're trying to change Caterpillar, or you're trying to change Ford Motor Company, or you're trying to change ExxonMobil, it's a very different game. Okay? The level of scale of the different dependencies and interactions is overwhelming. Okay? So the kinds of things that you might have done in one company when it was 50, 60, 70 people versus the kinds of things you're going to do when it's 35,000 people are very different. So the scale of the organization is going to inform your transformation. Dependencies are going to inform your transformation. There's going to be things that you're going to have to do in the presence of dependencies that you would like to not to have to do. I would suggest that the team level methods are way too naive when it comes to dependency management. A scrum of scrums is insufficient. What I would suggest that even with the scaled methodologies, right, scaled agile framework in particular, it has a protocol for dependency management, but I would suggest that in heavily dependent organizations that it's insufficient because those dependencies are real and they destabilize your delivery. Okay, so a lot of times early in a transformation, you have to put in compensating controls to deal with dependencies until you can break dependencies. Dependencies either have to be managed or they have to be broken. I don't believe that we can self-organize them away. There's people in this world that disagree with me. That's my point of view, right? I very seldomly see them actually get self-organized away because they're usually beyond the purview of the team. So the teams just kind of camp out on them and just deal with it. Okay? The third thing that I want you guys to consider is the level of resistance in the organization. 10 years ago, the question I would get asked all the time is, how do I get my executive leaders interested in Agile? That's not the question people are asking today. Executives want to do Agile. They just don't necessarily know how to get there. And so a lot of times I'll go into a conversation with somebody and I'll say, well, what's the level of resistance? And they'll go, oh, we don't have any resistance. The executives are totally bought in, right? But what happens, right, the executives are bought in thematically, but they don't fully understand the nature of the changes necessary to be able to get there. They want the benefit, they're willing to spend money, but at the end of the day, they're not necessarily ready to kind of break the plates, okay? Teams are typically pretty excited to be able to get there. But right, you know, we kind of joke about the middle, right? The middle manager, and we tend to deride them a little bit. But the challenge is that people they have jobs, they have careers, they have families. Change often represents not just a threat to your livelihood, but whether your kids can continue to go to college. Right? Whether you're respected in your community, right? You know, there's something that you've been successful doing for 25 years is now changing. So sometimes even if you don't get explicit resistance, you might get implicit resistance, right? Or, you know, somebody who says that they want to do it because they have to, but at the end of the day, they're kind of dragging their heels, right? Because it puts them at risk, okay? So rather than kind of minimize that, what I'm suggesting is that that's actually going to influence and change your change management strategy, okay? So we want to have a plan for addressing it, okay? So the third thing, now we're getting into, we've gone from kind of the why, and now we're talking about what are we going to go change. So when we think about doing a transformation, at some point we have to show up on day one and we have to move something. Okay? And so the way that I've been thinking about this and the way that I've been talking about this for the last couple years is that we need to decide what we're going to move and how we're going to move it, how that ties back into your transformation hypothesis, and how that goes back into your business case. Okay? The things that I think need to be moved first in most organizations is how that organization forms teams, builds backlogs, and produces working tested software. Okay? Nothing, in my opinion, in Scrum, and by extension SAFe, which is built on Scrum, or Less, which is built on Scrum. All of them are basically built on Scrum in some form or fashion, okay? I don't think anything in Scrum actually works unless you get your teams formed well, unless you can get your backlogs built the right way, and you can get to a definition of done at the end of the sprint. So I'm going to go through that just like really briefly, okay? So from a team perspective, let's talk about backlogs first since that's on my screen. So backlogs, right? Stacked ranked list of things that you want to put into the product that can be validated by a product owner that are relevant to the business, that can be broken down into 1 to 2 to 3 day chunks. A handful of them can be delivered within a sprint. When I first gave this talk at the Scrum Gathering in Vegas, I asked the room full of 500 Scrum enthusiasts who was building backlogs the way that this needed to be done. Nobody in the room raised their hand. Now, they might have been scared, but a few did, right? I guess a few did, but not enough for a Scrum Gathering, right? The next thing was, who is forming complete cross-functional teams of 6 to 8, 7 to 9 people that have autonomy to decide how that work in the backlog gets done. Right? Teams that don't have a ton of dependencies between them, so they can operate with some degree of autonomy. Almost nobody, right? That's a key, right? How many organizations can get to actually working, tested, validated increment of software at the end of the sprint? Okay? Almost nobody in the room raised their hands. What I would challenge you to think about is what can possibly work in Scrum if you don't have a clean backlog that the team can decide against and establish stable velocity against and get to a definition of done at the end of the sprint. I would suggest that almost every ceremony in Scrum will break down if you don't have those three things in place. And here's the interesting thing, especially if you're going for predictability and some of the heavier outcomes that the business is looking for. If you don't have a backlog, you don't know the size of your backlog. If you don't have a complete cross-functional team, you don't know your velocity, or it's incredibly unstable. If you can't get to a definition of done, then what happens is that there's an indeterminate pile of work that's stacking up behind you as you deliver stuff. You have no idea where you're at. You don't. Okay? So that's the thing that I sit on. It's like the only non-negotiable I've got in all of this stuff. If you can't figure out how to form teams, if you can't figure out how to build backlogs, if you can't figure out how to produce working tested software, then getting to that point is the work of the transformation. Okay? Now, as you start to think about scaling this kind of stuff, right, now we're having a different conversation at scale. We're talking about what is your team-based organizational structure all the way up the stack and out to the different groups, because we want collaboration and teamwork every place we can possibly get it. We want a governance model that's going to feed work into that system in a way that, that promotes agility rather than reduces agility. Governance is kind of a big, heavy word, but all it means is how are we going to make economic trade-offs in the face of uncertainty? Typically, there's kind of lean constructs, Kanban-based constructs, batch sizing strategies that you can do to do some really cool agile and adaptive governance kind of work. And then lastly, the idea of metrics and tools. Almost every large-scale organization is going to need some way to prove that it's making progress. One of the things that you can't do is use team velocity as a proxy for performance when you've got multiple teams that have to come together on an integrated deliverable. You have to have some way of measuring and controlling across teams to see how integrated features and epics are pulling together. Okay? So teams, backlogs, working tested software at the team level are the non-negotiables. Those things, when you start to scale up, tend to look like structure, governance, and metrics. Okay? Okay, so where are we at now, right? The other thing that I want you guys to consider as we go down this path, and I'm going to have to blow through this even quicker than I'm blowing through the rest of the stuff, right? The challenge is that different organizations in different markets have different kinds of goals. And so we have this model that we call our 4 quadrants, and it's basically predictability versus adaptability on the horizontal axis, emergence versus convergence on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis describes the attributes of your organization. Is it built for predictability? Is it built for change? And then the vertical axis describes the nature of your market. Does it want you to figure out the right thing, or does it think it already knows? Okay? And so what that implies is 4 quadrants. Lower left is predictive convergent, upper right is adaptive emergent, upper left is predictive emergent, lower right is adaptive convergent. The upper left quadrant tends to be the quadrant of heroics and chaos, and I might even say irrationality. You're built for predictability, stuff's changing all the time. I do a whole different talk that's based upon the same fundamental slides that talks about why Agile fails. Most of the time when companies are trying to adopt Agile, they're in that upper left quadrant, and they adopt Agile to try to get out of it. But Agile fails because the ecosystem around the teams doesn't support the kinds of things that they try to do in a pilot. Okay, so without going like super far down that path today, upper left is irrational, heroic, chaotic. Lower left tends to be the world of traditional SDLC, but I would argue that there's a lot of Agile that you can do in that lower left quadrant. It gets to your question, sir, over here on the left, right, is to, are there places you wouldn't do Agile? Well, there are places that you wouldn't do really fast, really loose, really unmanaged Agile, but there's almost no place that I wouldn't at least try to introduce some team-based iterative and incremental delivery, right? That's a lower left quadrant thing for me here, right? Lower right tends to be the home base of Agile. That's just where I tend to put SAFe and XP and Scrum, things like that. Upper right tends to be where I put Lean Startup. Might have less, might have some of Alistair's Crystal Clear stuff, right, into the upper right quadrant. So in the lower left quadrant, we're dealing with, I need stability, I need predictability, I need to be able to make and meet commitments. So I'm going to do things in that quadrant that are not necessarily Scrum. It might be heavier than SAFe sometimes, right? A lot of companies that are trying to adopt SAFe in the presence of dependencies between value streams need heavier coordination than even SAFe recommends, right? So we're not trying to do Agile at a team level, we're trying to do iterative and incremental delivery, because as you wind back through the talk, right, what we're really trying to get at is greater predictability, okay? Getting things in market faster so we can charge for them. Okay? So transformation often is a journey between states in these quadrants. When we first started thinking through this, right, the implications of this model, what we were kind of saying is that companies start in the upper left, they're trying to go to the upper right, but they fail because of the dependencies and the ecosystem problems. So what they have to do is they have to go from the upper left to the lower left to the lower right, and then to the upper right. That was kind of the hypothesis. And what we were saying is that adopting Agile, right, doing an Agile transformation is about forming teams, building backlogs, getting to the point we can produce working tested software. Okay? Agile at scale is about structure, governance, and metrics. But we know, based on our previous slide, that there's a ton of stuff that is going to get in the way of that. Okay? So the idea is you design for the organization that you want, you recognize in advance the impediments to getting there, because it's not like it's a total crapshoot. We know 80 to 90% of the things that are going to get in the way before you even start. Okay, so let's not pretend that we have to stub our toe over and over and over and over and over again. Right? We can enumerate those things, right? So we design for the organization we want. We put in compensating controls to deal with the dependencies and the issues of scale. And then as we're able to break dependencies over time, we can start deprecating some of the compensating controls. Does that make sense? Okay? And so what's the worst thing that you can do is pretend dependencies don't exist and pretend that these organizational factors are not going to get in the way. Start delivering cultural messages, start getting people to do new practices, and have them fail as a result of the impediments that they don't have control over removing. Okay? So what it boils down to is that the work of the transformation really becomes not training people on how to do Agile, but it becomes systematically removing the barriers to agility. That's what it means to make systematic, long-term, meaningful change. Okay? And you got to work your way back, right? How are you going to get there? Okay, so it's like one of the things that that I've got up here is, you know, from a methodology perspective, it doesn't matter which methodology you choose. One of the things that I like to say is that every methodology that was ever created, that anybody ever wrote a book around, worked for somebody at some point in time. There's not one that's better or worse than the others. Okay, what it comes down to is that that company had a certain set of goals. It had a certain set of constraints, and it built the methodology to capture the goals and constraints of that particular organization. Somebody gets the wise idea and says, okay, I'm going to go build a methodology around it, create a certification around it, I'm going to go sell it, I'm going to go create a company. In order to do that, it has to be a thing. Okay? The challenge is that thing will only work in your environment if you have the same business goals and the same sets of constraints that that organization had. So pick your methodology, that's fine, but what you have to do is you have to create the conditions where that methodology is going to thrive. If you can't create the conditions for that methodology to thrive, then you need to adapt the methodology. None of this stuff almost ever works out of the box. And anybody who's smart and pragmatic and has really done this will tell you that. You guys with me? Okay, let's do a quick time check. How are we doing? Gosh, 30 minutes is gone already. Awful. Okay, so what I want to do on this particular slide is I want to talk about the journey, right? So what we've done is we've coined a series of intermediate steps we call Basecamps, right? First Basecamp, stabilize the system. Second Basecamp, reduce batch size. Third Basecamp, break dependencies, allow for autonomous teams. Fourth Basecamp, start to change your portfolio management structure so that you can feed work to those independent autonomous teams. And then when you get to Basecamp 5, let those teams begin to start to innovate. Okay, depending upon what your goals are is going to depend on which Basecamp that you shoot towards. So reference architecture. Okay, going to hit this really, really quick, okay? Different teams at different levels of the organization that are designed to do different things, okay? So SAFe basically has its own pattern for how to scale teams. Everybody's got their own pattern. These are the things that I think are kind of the core, right? Services teams at the bottom, feature teams, program teams, portfolio teams. When we start talking about structure, we're talking about the relationships between those teams and how work is going to flow from the top to the bottom. That's actually governance. Governance tends to look something like this, right? A flow-based system at the top, a flow-based system in the middle, and then Scrum or Kanban down at the lower levels, right? So you have epics flowing through the top, they get decomposed into features which flow through the middle, and then you have user stories that fall out of that and that flow through the bottom tier. If you were going to do something like SAFe, I would suggest it's the similar kind of a thing, but you're batching up every PI and you're bringing a set of requirements to the team. One of the key failure modes I believe in SAFe, and I'm sure it works for some people, but this idea that we're going to show up in a 2-day meeting and the backlog's going to come out of that meeting, I typically believe that that is insufficient. Okay? Typically believe that's insufficient. You can do 4-tier governance. Metrics, right? Each tier has a unique set of metrics, right? At the lower tier, you're dealing with Scrum type metrics. As you get in the middle and you get in the top tier, you're dealing with more lean type metrics. Okay? The point isn't what's in this slide. You can read about that in the paper. The point is that as you begin to scale this, you have to think about how does the overall system work together. Okay? What's your reference architecture? How are you going to form teams? How are you going to govern the teams? How's work going to flow into those teams? And then what are you going to measure and control? That is not going to emerge naturally. That has to be designed, my opinion. Okay, so now we get into a really interesting story around incremental and iterative change management. Okay, so to me, the unit of value of a transformation is a transformed organization. The unit of value of a transformation is not the number of people you trained. It's not even the number of teams that you formed, or the number of people that say they're doing Scrum, or the number of teams that self-assess on a diagram. Those things can be valid, okay? But a performing organization is the unit of value. That's what the organization's paying for. Anything else, in my opinion, is a vanity metric. So what we have to do is we have to think about strategies for how we are going to slice the organization in such a way that we can bring it to an improved state of performance. And so we've kind of coined this expression we call expeditions, right? So an expedition is a group of teams that are going to take a journey together, okay? And so you break the organization into these expeditions. The hallmark of an expedition is that it does teams, backlogs, working tested software, structure, governance, and metrics at every level. The idea is that the expedition's overall performance should start to be an indicator of improved delivery within the enterprise in a way that is meaningful at the portfolio level. Okay? So you split vertically across the stack to identify slices of the organization where teams can go together. The iterative nature of it Okay, so we're thinking increments and iterations, right? Just like we do with software. The iterative nature of it takes it from line diagram to watercolor to oil painting, if anybody's familiar with Jeff Patton's Mona Lisa picture, right? So the first step is get it to Basecamp 1. It's not as agile as we want it to be, but we know that the ecosystem is not going to support independent Scrum teams. So what tends to happen is we tend to form Scrum teams, we put in program and portfolio governance, we get the system of delivery working, we get the metrics and controls, and we respect the heck out of dependencies, and we do more forward planning than we would normally like to. Because we're kind of making a deal with the organization. You let us do Agile, we're still going to play by your rules. But then what starts to happen is as you roll into Basecamp 2, Basecamp 3, Basecamp 4, Basecamp 5, what starts to happen is that you earn trust with the organization. Basecamp 1, we can out-project manage the PMI guys by doing Agile. It's kind of a crazy idea. Back in the day, 10, 12 years ago, I could out-project manage the traditional project managers using Agile because we were following these kind of fundamental things. As you start to break dependencies and as you improve the ecosystem and as you get the people into the right places and the right seats on the bus, you can start to deprecate some of that forward planning and you can start to thin out some of those compensating controls. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to create an ecosystem through the transformation where you have expeditions running through base camps, you're moving systematically through the organization, and what's really cool is that when you think about it and when you kind of get the mindset shift, ironic I'm using mindset, right? When you get the mindset shift that the unit of value of the transformation is a transformed organization, and you start to think about what does incremental improvement look like from the customer's perspective, it puts a whole new spin on the idea of using Scrum to introduce Agile, right? It's not using Scrum to burn down the amount of training we've run people through, but it's using Scrum to manage the flow of work, to manage the flow and the states of the different parts of the organization that we're changing. Okay? Matt here. Okay. So I'm going to hit this just at a really, really high level, and it's unfortunate because this is actually the one piece that I didn't actually write into the white paper. But the idea behind creating a script and creating a change management kind of framework is that now that we're using Agile to actually improve the organization, we can start to think about building leadership coalitions. We can define an end state vision. Right? I don't think we have to let our Agile transformation emerge. I think that you can create this hypothesis for the organization to consider, talk about the economics, what it's going to take to get there, how we're going to approach it, and get them to move in that direction, right? We're being incredibly transparent with the organization about what's ahead of us, right? We can build a roadmap. Okay, a roadmap for us is typically expeditions moving to base camps. That's the level of granularity. And you can typically do that 9 to 12 months out. You can create a 90-day rolling plan. You can do 30-day checkpoints against that rolling plan. What we're doing is we're creating a tremendous amount of safety organizationally for the change. So if anybody's has their PMP, any PMPs in here real quick? Yep, I used to have one. I let it lapse a while ago. I got tired of filling out the paperwork. And so, and you know, when you start owning your own company, nobody asks you for your PMP certification anymore, right? But basically, we talked about rolling wave planning, progressive elaboration, right? I think rolling wave planning and progressive elaboration is fair. Most large product organizations, even if they're doing Agile, have some sort of product roadmap. They've got some sort of 90-day release plan. They're operating in 2-week to 4-week sprints. Right? That's all we're suggesting here. I'm not saying you got to know everything, but you got to have a hypothesis about where you're going. Connect activities to outcomes. Connect outcomes to business objectives. Incorporate feedback. Manage communication. Create safety for everyone. Okay, so grab the deck off of our website, leadingagile.com, and you can kind of read what's up underneath this stuff. But building a change management plan for how you're going to keep all of these middle managers safe over time is a big deal. Because we've got two goals, right? We've got to keep the executives safe by justifying the spend, and we've got to keep the middle managers safe by being able to measurably demonstrate progress. Because what creates a lack of safety is when the execs are spending a lot of money, hiring a lot of people, and the middle managers have no idea what kind of progress we're making, right? That's going to kill us no matter what, okay? So now we're going to get into results management, okay? The idea behind results management is we've got two basic classes of results. We have transformation metrics and we have business metrics, okay? So we want to be able to measure how the transformation is progressing, and then we want to be able to derive from that, see correlation between how the organization is progressing and then how the business and the economics are progressing as well, right? So we have this idea of capability improvement. So I'll just kind of read through these. Define the product, plan and coordinate, deliver the solution, organizational enablement, continuous improvement. If anybody's familiar with Sally Alata's Agile Transformation, the kind of the radio diagrams, this is in the class of that kind of stuff, right? How are we progressing in terms of our ability to actually do this stuff, okay? We're going to measure progress, right? We can measure the activities that we're doing, Scrum Masters trained, CSMs obtained, Agile boot camps run, right? That's all valid stuff, okay? But at the end of the day, those things have to roll up to things like the team has stable velocity. We can get stable feature throughput at the program level. We can get stable epic throughput, right? We're starting to see stability. We're starting to reduce variation. That's what I mean by outcomes. And then ultimately, those outcomes get to something like Basecamp 1, which is the system is reliable and predictable as a delivery unit, okay? Then we get into the business metrics, right? So the goals and outcomes we saw in the first slide, right? Are we predictable? Can we put things in market? Can we start to sell the things that we're trying to do? Have we reduced costs? Can we innovate? Can we make sure that we're building the right product? Right? Can we measure that? One of the things I've told my teams is it's super easy to get on site with a client, and sometimes the people on the ground don't want to measure anything. And I'm like, look guys, if we can't measure this stuff, we're dead man walking, because somebody's paying some money for us to be there. And if we can't prove the business benefit, and we can't connect that dot, we're in an incredibly weak position. As internal change agents, I would suggest that you guys are in an incredibly weak position if you're basically just saying, fund my team, and we're just going to hope for the best, right? I don't think that's sufficient, okay? So the idea of being able to tie back to the goals and objectives that we talked about, and then financial measurements, right? And this has to do with capitalization and internal rate of return and right, all kinds of stuff, right? There's a lot of economics that you can tie to this conversation. I got 4 minutes left, it's awful. Okay, so as we've gotten better at this, like one of the things that we've recognized is that there are different roles on an engagement. There are different roles when you guys are doing this internally. And the general pattern here is that there's people that can create space, there's people that can fill space, there's people that can execute against that space, and there's people that can do the work, okay? And unfortunately, those 4 core roles are often really different people. You need somebody that can hold the executive's mind share and get them to want to do this. You need people that can design the end state, right, and craft the vision. And then you need people that can manage the execution against these expeditions, base camps, outcomes, and activities. And then you need people on the ground that can train people in things like how to decompose user stories. Okay? Doesn't necessarily have to be 4 people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a stacked layer, but making sure that you have all 4 of those things considered is a big deal. The other side, and where I'll kind of leave this, is as we've evolved this stuff, the one thing that we've learned the hard way over and over and over again is that the different kinds of skills that you need are different depending upon the layers of the organization that somebody's operating in. Agile skills and knowledge is like the price of admission. If you don't have that, then you're just kind of like, you just don't get to show up, right? Having had some experience doing this kind of stuff is pretty important. Not being a jerk, right? Being a good culture fit, right? That kind of stuff. That's like the 1.0 stuff. Where we started getting to at some point was, do you get your feelings hurt? Do you go in the corner and hide when you get your feelings hurt? How do you handle it when people disagree with you? You know, those kinds of things, right? That became a key part of our ability to put transformational change agents. We started playing around with the idea of EQ and IQ. right? Do you have the ability to understand when somebody's afraid or scared? Can you tailor your message to them in their unique situation when you're under pressure? I think that's an attribute of IQ a little bit, okay? Can you read people and can you dynamically problem solve? And then for us, the holy grail are people that can see systems and recognize patterns. Okay? One of the analogies I used with my team at one point is back in the 90s, these things called stereograms were, remember, it's like they look like static, and you like stare at them and like a unicorn and a rainbow pops up out of it, or a pirate ship or something like that. It's like, it's a little bit like that, right? You've got to kind of like be able to look at all of this mess and be able to derive truth from it, to be able to communicate to other people what you're able to see, and then to put together a plan for how to get there. Right? It's daunting, right? And so, you know, titles are neither here nor there for this conversation, but like where I wanted to leave you guys with is that given all of that, right? So I gave you some specifics as much as I could in 45 minutes. But the thing that I want to leave you guys with is that you've got to anchor to the business case. Because if your activities can't anchor to the business case, then you're on really, really shaky ground. You have to place a bet. You have to say, what are the things that I'm doing and what is the line of sight to how those things are going to actually achieve the business goals. You have to be able to define an approach, right? You've got to be able to communicate to the organization, what moves are we going to make to be able to get there, okay? You have to understand and have at least some idea of what done looks like. Okay? You have to have some idea of how we're going to move iteratively and incrementally towards done. Change management plan, you got to be able to measure results, and then you've got to have the right people in the right levels of the organization that can actually move the kinds of things that you need to be able to move. Because chances are, somebody who's great at Scrum and knows everything about how to coach and facilitate a team might not be the best person to go up and have that executive conversation and to wrap all this stuff together. But somebody in your change initiative is going to have to be able to do that. Okay? That was a lot, okay? And it was at a high level. But like I said, grab the deck, grab the paper, email me if you have any questions. I'm happy to help. But just take these things into consideration. If you've got holes in your plan, use this as a guide to close those holes. I hope it helps.